Well, I hope you had a good lunch. We always notice that there are a few stragglers who are probably still eating, but hopefully they will come back. This afternoon session will be interesting in one respect, no PowerPoints. So that's the good news, because that means you have to pay attention to the speakers. Otherwise, you can be distracted by something called PowerPoints. The title of the third panel is China's Western Energy March and Geopolitics, How Does It Fit In? Now we're getting back to vision strategy, so not devil in the detail, which was the second session. Therefore, the speakers, and I'm taking liberties here, can say almost anything. But I think that's the whole question is, where is China going vis-a-vis Central Asia / Russia, the Eurasian space, in the energy game? We have 3 speakers this afternoon, and the order will be Jeffrey Mankoff, who is now with CSIS. He's had a prior life in the Council on Foreign Relations and others. And he will start off. We will have Dan Stein, who is with the U.S. government and has been involved in energy matters a little bit longer than me. Okay, so that means I'm dating both of us by that comment. And then there's Ed Chow, who I won't even comment on whether he's going to outdate both Dan and myself. But at any rate, these are people who, from both academic, political, policy, and on-the-ground experience. So I think it will be a very dynamic group. And the only constraint we have this afternoon is the following. We must finish exactly at 4, and it's not because I wish to play policeman. The room is going to be used, and they need to set up. So I will have to be impolite if there are questions that end at 4. They will literally end at 4. Without further ado, Jeffrey will be the first one to set the pace, and then we will continue from there. Jeff, and you can either be at your seat or up here as you wish.
Okay. I guess if it's all the same to everybody else, I'll just stay down here because I'm lazy. So Jenik told me I was going to be going first on this panel and said if I didn't like it, I could always hold a referendum to secede. So I think I may do that. No, seriously, I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank Jenik and Harriman for having me. So as was said, with this panel, we're going to step back a little bit and look at some of the bigger geostrategic consequences of the phenomena that we've heard about from the previous panelists. And I'm going to focus, obviously, on what China is doing in Central Asia, but because we're talking about the bigger geopolitical picture, I think it's worth also stepping back from that a little bit and focusing on geopolitical impacts that are not necessarily about or not only about China. Before doing that, though, I think it's worth just appreciating the scope of the changes that have taken place over the course of the last decade or so as Chinese investment has flowed into oil and gas developments in Central Asia. For Kazakhstan right now, even though the majority of oil is still shipped to Russia and through Russian pipelines, about 16% goes to China. That is likely going to grow, particularly with China now, with CNPC now having a stake in Kashagan, which in and of itself is a sign of Chinese political influence in the region. Gas as well. We don't know ultimately how much is actually going to be flowing out. According to CNPC, the full capacity of the Central Asia-China pipeline, once all the branch lines of it are completed, is going to be somewhere around 70 BCM a year. Where all that gas will come from, I mean, that's another question. Turkmenistan, 52% of its gas is currently exported to China, and this is a huge change from just less than 5 years ago. That 52%, that's more than double what Turkmenistan exports to Russia. It was about 24%. The framework agreement that was signed between Beijing and Ashgabat in 2012 calls for raising deliveries to 65 BCM a year by 2020. And this coupled with China's success in gaining equity stakes in some of the upstream projects in Turkmenistan as well as in Kazakhstan something that both Western companies and Russia and Indian companies, in the case of Kazakhstan, have struggled to do, is a sign that there's something afoot here beyond just kind of typical commercial deals. There is a bigger geopolitical context to all of this. And finally, I just want to mention briefly Uzbekistan, which we haven't talked about very much so far. But last year it exported about 10 BCM of gas to China, despite the fact that it had its own internal energy shortages. And I think this is an issue that may come up again and it'll be worth exploring a little bit. There's also talk underway now of building the so-called Line D, the fourth branch of the Central Asia-China gas pipeline, which, if constructed, would also go through Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, which means that if it's built, and again, it's an if, means that potentially all 5 Central Asian states would have Chinese-controlled gas pipelines across them. Again, if sufficient volumes are available, if funding comes through, and if the projects are actually built. I'm sorry, I said before, it's 80 BCM a year that China is looking to import through these pipelines from Central Asia by 2020, which at this point is projected to be 40% of China's total gas imports by 2020 coming from Central Asia. Now, it's clear that China needs significant gas imports to feed its economic growth, which even if the slowdown that we've seen in China over the last couple of years continues, is still likely to be quite high. At the same time, of course, we've seen increasingly the problems that China has had with climate and pollution issues. And so the pressure to increase the percentage of gas in the energy mix is only going to grow. And in some sense, this is a problem of domestic politics and domestic stability in China itself. Because if pollution continues to get worse, that's a potential source of vulnerability for the government. All that said, and without denying the importance of the phenomena that we're talking about here, it's worth keeping in mind still, and I think, for those of you who think about China are aware of this, but it's just worth sort of putting out there, that nevertheless, despite all of this, the bulk of China's population, the bulk of its economic assets, and its geostrategic interests lie to the east and southeast of the country, much more than to the west, which is, for China, a sort of secondary front. However, and this has come up earlier in the day, while Central Asia may not be a huge component in the Chinese strategic universe, China, simply by virtue of its size and the sheer disparity in terms of economic power, demographics, and even military potential, China is a huge player in the Central Asian universe. Even though the volumes of trade between the Central Asian countries and China are comparatively insignificant from the Chinese perspective, 4 out of the 5 Central Asian states now have China as their #1 trading partner. So the reorientation of the Central Asian economies towards China, much of which is based on energy, is fully underway. But from Beijing's perspective, Central Asia is important geopolitically, but it's not fundamental in a way that, say, Taiwan or the South China Sea is fundamental. That said, the rapid penetration of Chinese investment and infrastructure into Central Asia is having substantial, even enormous impacts on the ground in that part of the world, and in some sense may be outrunning Beijing's own ability to cope with or think about the broader geopolitical consequences. So this gets to the question of whether or not there's a strategy behind Chinese activity in Central Asia. Certainly there are resources being poured in, but at the end of the day, given the role that this part of the world plays in Chinese strategic thinking, I think it is very much open to question the extent to which there is a well-thought-out strategy and where Central Asia fits into the bigger picture of Chinese geopolitics. So with those caveats out there, I want to talk about some of the bigger geostrategic consequences for the penetration of Chinese investment, particularly in the energy sector, into Central Asia could be. And I'm going to talk about 5 of these, and I think I'm going to do it in the order of from the most intended to the least intended. Because some of these, I think, are liable to be more byproducts rather than things that are actually directly sought by the Chinese government. But at the other end, at the end of those phenomena that are clearly intended, I think are really two. And both of these have been touched on in some of the earlier presentations, but I want to go through them again, maybe in a slightly different form. First is the reduction of vulnerability of supply lines for energy to China. Right now, China imports about 6 million barrels of oil. The vast majority of that comes from the Middle East. And there are real concerns, of course, about disruptions, whether from the U.S. Navy, which, of course, as the Sino-American relationship becomes more complex and potentially more heated, becomes more of a problem, but also the reality of political risk in the Middle East itself, which with the Arab Spring having not run its full course or burned itself out, continues to be an issue. Also, concerns closer to home, for example, with maritime choke points, piracy, and the like. So for all of these reasons, there is a real interest in hedging the risk of these overseas supply routes. Of course, compared to bringing supplies, particularly of gas, from elsewhere in the world, Central Asia is close by. If you're talking about pipelines, it's potentially cheaper once the pipelines are in place. The problem with all of this, though, is that even though one of the impetuses for moving into Central Asia is to diversify risk away from the Middle East, in some sense there's a contradictory problem that comes with all of this, which is that by moving into Central Asia, China is exposing itself to political risk within Central Asia itself, which is an area that has its own landscape of political, economic, and geopolitical challenges. So we mentioned Line D before, which is this planned branch of the Central Asia-China pipeline through Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Well, part of the backstory for this, part of the rationale given by Chinese officials for why you want to build this pipeline is because of issues in the past with supplies from Turkmenistan being diverted along the existing routes of the pipelines to make up for shortages seemingly resulting from Uzbekistan siphoning off gas crossing through its territory. So already this is an example of one of the risks of pipelines through Central Asia. You have 5 countries that don't necessarily get along with each other or trust each other, and in a sense you're making yourself vulnerable to these intramural rivalries among these countries. So you have the potential for conflicts within Central Asia to affect energy transit, but of course you also have the potential for significant internal political challenges and instability within Central Asia itself. There's, I think, a perception in Beijing that the political risk in Central Asia is much less than in the Middle East, in part because of the large-scale disorders that you've had in places like Egypt, Syria, and elsewhere, and the potential for these to spread to some of the major energy producers in the Middle East. Whereas in Central Asia, you don't have this phenomenon yet. And I'd like to emphasize yet, because when you're talking about pipelines, these are long-term investments. These are things that are supposed to operate over the course of not just years, but decades. And the potential for political instability in several of the Central Asian countries over the course, not of the next year perhaps, but of the next 10 to 20 years is quite significant. You have demographic bulges, you have aging leaders, unresponsive political systems, rise of religious extremism, stagnant economies. I mean, the whole kind of litany of problems that led to disorder in the Middle East already. So that, on top of the difficult relationships among several of the countries themselves, and you're talking about the potential for real political risk in Central Asia itself. Now, in any case, it's not as if China can ever entirely uncouple itself from the Middle East. For one thing, the volumes just aren't there. And with oil especially, because it's a globally traded commodity, there's a global market, prices are set globally, events in the Middle East are going to continue to matter. Now here it's also worth for a second mentioning Russia, because China is already, as we know, a major importer of Russian oil, and depending what happens with the negotiations and the Xi Jinping-Vladimir Putin summit in May, potentially of gas too. And I'll talk about this in a little bit, but China's move into Central Asia also has potentially profound impacts for relations between Beijing and Moscow, and I just want to flag that right now. More broadly, of course, when we talk about China's penetration into Central Asia, it's been led in the first instance by pipelines, by energy, but over time, and especially in the last year or so since Xi Jinping's travel around Central Asia and the announcement of a series of Chinese investment deals with all 5 of the Central Asian countries, this investment in pipelines that's been going on for the last several years is increasingly being embedded in this broader vision of what President Xi has talked about as the Silk Road economic belt, which is the construction of a wider set of transportation links across Eurasia between China and Europe. And this, as we heard earlier from Raffaella Pantucci, is very much part of a bigger Chinese strategy that's been going on for several years to secure its own western frontier, which first and foremost means Xinjiang. So the second really intended consequence of China's push into Central Asia is securing Xinjiang and providing security on its own western frontier. And in this sense, the push for energy from Central Asia is very much part of a program in China that's been referred to as, and I don't speak Chinese, so I'm not sure which of these translations is best, but the Western Development Drive, or the Develop the West program, or the Go West program, or something like that, which basically aims at bringing the fruit of Chinese economic growth and development to the West, to Xinjiang, which has historically been an underdeveloped area of the country, lower standard of living, less integration not only into the global economy, but less integration into the Chinese economy as well. And there are many in Beijing, and I think in the party as well, who regard the development disparity between East and West as the root cause of the instability that Xinjiang has perpetually suffered from, and therefore seeks to use economic development as a tool to address the social, political, and economic grievances of the Uyghur, but not only Uyghur population of this region. And of course, if this succeeds, if China succeeds in bringing greater security to its western frontier, that means that it has a greater scope for a more active approach to foreign policy on its east and its southeast and at the global level. And so, in a sense, this isn't only a local issue, but it could have, if we're talking about the bigger geostrategic landscape, it could have a significant impact. Because a China that's confident in its own borders is one that is able to play a much more assertive global role. Now, there's a Central Asian piece to this as well, because security on the frontier isn't only about Xinjiang per se, but it also means ensuring that the Central Asian states are cooperative on this issue by investing lots of money, by developing a deep-seated economic relationship with the Central Asian states. This ensures that Beijing has significant influence in the capitals of these countries, and it uses that influence. We've already seen this now, even though China's emphasis on security issues has been quite restrained, to ensure that these countries tend to be cooperative on issues related to stability in Xinjiang and to Uyghur exile groups. And so, you know, it's one of the few areas of security that China is not afraid to bring up in its bilateral conversations and in the context of the SCO with the Central Asian countries, making sure that Uyghur groups don't have a platform to agitate for political or territorial change within Central Asia. Now, again, the Chinese perception is that the bulk of the problems related to Xinjiang are socioeconomic in nature, and that by improving the development level in the region, it'll be able to overcome these problems and more effectively integrate Xinjiang into China more broadly, and thereby secure its western frontier. To a lot of outside observers, of course, the problems are more complex than that, and they're cultural and political problems that are much deeper seated than purely a question of economic development. And this has to do with the disparity between Uyghurs and Hans and the influx of ethnic Hans into Xinjiang, which now is no longer even majority Uyghur. And if that's the case, if the outside observers looking at this are correct, then economic development may not succeed in addressing the problems of instability in China's West, and in some sense could exacerbate them if one of the consequences is that you have greater disparities on the ground in Xinjiang between the Han and Uyghur populations, which we've already seen growing. Okay, so if these are the two sort of real intended strategic consequences, I would say, of the Chinese push into Central Asia, let me talk about three that I think are, to various degrees, a little bit less intended. First is that China really becomes a Central Asian player, or a Central Asian stakeholder. As I was just saying, on strategic and security issues, China has, for the most part, apart from the very sensitive Uyghur issue, generally preferred to stay out of it in Central Asia, to not be a regional security actor. Nevertheless, as its investment profile in the region grows, it becomes a stakeholder. It has concrete interests that it needs to protect and an investment in the preservation of the political and territorial status quo. And because we're talking about energy exports, which have a real significance for Chinese domestic politics and for the stability of China itself, the encouragement, the importance of this region for China and the inclination of China to involve itself in Central Asian politics, I think, grows over time. And in a way, this can become self-fulfilling if the backlash against China, the Sinophobia that was talked about on some of the earlier panels, becomes a real problem in Central Asia. Or, for example, if there are, if the supplies of energy that China is contracted for aren't actually delivered because of problems in some of the Central Asian countries, or because, or problems between them. So it's a question that's worth asking: what would China do in the event of either clashes among one or more of the Central Asian states, or the political breakdown of one of the Central Asian states in which it has important energy investments? I don't think I know the answer to that question. I'm not sure Beijing knows the answer to that question, but I think it's a good question to ask, and it's something that should be at least out there. And additionally, of course, how would others react? How would Russia react? How would the Western powers react? Okay, so that's number 3, I guess, of my 5. Number 4 is changing the tenor of Russo-Chinese relations. There's obviously been tension between Russia and China in Central Asia for some time, but for a variety of reasons it hasn't blossomed into a full-fledged confrontation. And we can talk about why that is in the Q&A. I'm not going to go into it in excessive detail now. Beijing nevertheless argues that its interests and those of Russia are in Central Asia basically compatible. Both want stability, both favor preserving the political status quo, neither wants an assertive U.S. presence in the region. And as far as it goes, I think that's all true. But when it comes to energy and to energy sales, it's not necessarily true, I think, that Russian and Chinese interests are the same, and is there a tipping point at which the tensions over these issues lead to a more fundamental confrontation between the two countries? In any case, it's clear that Central Asia is moving out from under the influence that Russia has had over it for the last 150 or more years. The historical legacy of the Soviet Union in terms of trading relationships, supply chains, infrastructure is already waning, and China is an important factor in the promotion of that waning. To differing degrees, the Russian cultural legacy is diminishing as well. In some of the Central Asian countries, it's hard to find somebody younger than me, let's say, or born since the collapse of the Soviet Union, who speaks Russian. At some point, there's going to be a generational shift, and you're going to have leaders in these countries who don't have organic ties to Russia or to Russian culture, and are going to see themselves and see their countries in a fundamentally different place from where the current generation of elites tends to see them. And that could potentially have a significant impact on the relationship between Beijing and Moscow in the region as well. Now, so far, Moscow and Beijing have been mostly able to get along in Central Asia because it hasn't been a real high priority, I guess, for either one of them. Despite the fact that China has moved in pretty aggressively on the energy front, Russia hasn't done a lot to challenge that. And I think the main argument you hear for why that is because if Central Asia is selling its energy to China, then it's not selling its energy to Europe, which is still Russia's most important and most lucrative market. And so, in a sense, it actually serves Russian interests to have Central Asian energy going to China and not competing with Gazprom in Europe. Okay, fair enough. At the same time, China is largely content to free ride on security issues and let Russia take responsibility for dealing with counterterrorism, for managing conflicts between the countries and the like, whether on a bilateral basis or through the CSTO. Again, though, if China becomes more of a stakeholder and has more of its own concrete interests at stake in Central Asia, then to what extent is it going to continue to be willing to defer to Russia or to allow Russia to manage these important security issues? We've already seen, some tension play out in the context of the SCO, and it's one of the big reasons that the SCO never has quite evolved into the full-fledged bloc or alliance, or whatever you want to call it, that its founders, I think, envisioned for it. And we've seen it in, talk over the SCO Development Bank and the creation of a bailout fund or a free trade zone or anything else. I mean, basically anything that involves money has been a non-starter for the Russians, just because the Russians don't have as much money as the Chinese do. And anything that involves trade or finance or anything else under an SCO aegis is going to be de facto run by the Chinese. And so far, at least, the Russians haven't been willing to go down that route. Now, in the aftermath of the Crimea drama, and if there's a fundamental shift in the relationship between Europe, the West, and Russia, then does that change? I mean, again, that's an interesting question to put out there. In any case, the Eurasian Union idea and the customs union idea, it seems pretty clear, and talking to Russians involved with this, you get the sense that one of the goals was to limit the economic reorientation of the Central Asian states towards China. And if you look at the trade statistics since since the customs union has come into effect, the impact on Kazakhstan, it seems to be that there is actually a trade diversion effect at work, where the trade between Kazakhstan and China has declined relative to what it would have been without the customs union, and trade between Kazakhstan and Russia has risen. And that presumably was one of the intended goals. Again, what are the consequences of the Crimean crisis going to be for the further development and institutionalization of the customs union and the Eurasian Union? We've already seen a lot of unhappiness with these institutions, particularly coming from the Kazakh government, but also from the Belarusians. And even though the Kyrgyz and the Tajiks have said that they are studying and are probably going to join at some point, it's been with a distinct lack of enthusiasm. And so we'll see what happens. Of course, China has put forward this idea of the Silk Road economic belt, which is in some ways being depicted as an alternative to the Russian-led Eurasian Union. In fact, there were a couple of stories in the People's Daily shortly after Xi Jinping's travel to Central Asia last year, where the editorial line put forward was basically that the Silk Road economic belt was a superior alternative to the Eurasian Union because it was open. It wasn't a closed bloc. It was open to everybody. And the Eurasian Union, this sort of Russian-led process of Eurasian integration, could become one piece of this bigger Silk Road economic belt, which would actually be more advantageous because it would connect Asia to Europe, and it would allow for countries to access a much bigger and more dynamic market than anything focused on Russia would necessarily be. I don't think it would be controversial to say that Russia probably doesn't agree with that view, but is it in a position to do anything about it? And so this is all in the perspective of Central Asia, but just in terms of Russo-Chinese relationship, I would also talk about in a more bilateral context. And here we can come back to the talks that have been ongoing now for years about China's potential purchase of Russian gas supplies. The fact that China has been successful in accessing significant amounts of energy in Central Asia and potentially accessing even more means that China's in a much stronger bargaining position with Russia over accessing Russian gas supplies from Siberia. The sticking point in these negotiations has been the price. What price was China going to pay to Russia for this gas? And part of the reason that China has been able to hold out for a better deal, one, of course, has been the development of North American and other shale gas, which opens up the potential for a much bigger and more liquid global LNG market, but also because even in the shorter term, China has been successful at getting much of the energy that it needs from Central Asia. And the more that it moves into Central Asia, the more Central Asian options it has, the more constrained Russia is in terms of demanding a higher price based on the oil-linked price that it gets for the gas that it sells in Europe. And already, and this came up in one of the earlier presentations as well, China achieved a major concession from Russia in the sense of getting Moscow to agree that only East Siberian gas would be supplied as part of this gas supply deal, not West Siberian gas, which means that Russia can't play the role of a swing supplier. It can't play Europe and China off of each other by threatening to withhold gas supplies from China to sell it to Europe if China doesn't do what it likes. And here, the drama in Crimea, I think, only accelerates this process of shifting the bargaining leverage more in China's favor. More broadly, Russia-China relations at the bilateral level were, I think, becoming warier in the run-up to the Crimea crisis, which is only going to accelerate them. If you look at Russian activities in Southeast Asia, for example, the development of Russia's strategic partnership with Vietnam, the sale of Russian military equipment to India, and the reluctance of the Russian military to sell advanced equipment to China, it's becoming pretty clear that there's a very strong current of opinion in Moscow and in the Russian military that views excessive dependence on China as a threat. And even though has been an emphasis under Putin on strengthening this strategic partnership with Beijing, there's also, I think, a wariness about pushing that partnership too far, about becoming overly dependent on China. And one of the consequences of this has been a Russian attempt to diversify within Asia, to gain closer relations with other major Asian countries, including Japan, including South Korea, including Vietnam, including some others. But also not to push the bilateral rapprochement with China too far, to maintain a certain degree of limits, for example, on issues of military sales. The big question hanging over all of this, of course, is what the impact of the Crimea crisis is going to be. If, in fact, the leadership in Moscow feels that its options in the West are foreclosed, does that then mean that some of these concerns about overdependence on China become swept under the rug? Or that it's a price that enough people in Moscow are willing to accept. And that, I think, is an open question. And then, of course, another open question is what happens if the gas deal doesn't get signed? What then does that mean, not only for the Russo-China relationship, but also specifically for Central Asia? And I'll just sort of put that out there. Okay, so that's 4. 5, and I'll end on this, and this is, I think, also an unintended consequence of the Chinese move into Central Asia, but not entirely unintended. And that is a change in the way that Central Asia interacts with the world, with the international community. So far, the insertion of China into Central Asia has generally been good for what the U.S. has long called for in the region, geopolitical pluralism. In fact, it's been a pillar of U.S. strategy in Central Asia since the early 90s that the United States supports geopolitical pluralism, that it supports the sovereignty and independence of all of the post-Soviet states. And that means, among other things, their ability to choose their international alignments for themselves. To the extent that there was a concern about any one country exercising too much influence in the region, for the last 20 years, that concern has been directed at Russia. And of course, as Central Asia became more multipolar with the insertion especially of Chinese economic influence, that actually meant that the Central Asian countries had more options. The fact of the matter is that the United States itself was never going to be a major player in Central Asia. It's too far away. It has too many other interests in other parts of the world. The war in Afghanistan was a little bit of an exception, I think, that proved the rule in that regard. But especially with the U.S. pulling out of Afghanistan, the possibility for Washington to continue being a central player in Central Asia is receding. And for that reason, having a multipolar, or at least a bipolar strategic environment in Central Asia helps reinforce the U.S. goal of strategic pluralism, of giving the Central Asian states options in terms of their international engagement. And of course, that's a good thing. The Central Asian states, of course, like this too, and that's part of their thinking in developing partnerships with China, is it gives them options against Russia as well. I think this was most notable with Turkmenistan, when the energy pipeline explosion in 2009 cut off its sales of gas to Russia. It immediately turned to China, which not only bought much more gas, but also invested a lot more money into the country, which allowed Turkmenistan to get out from under the pressure that Russia had exerted on its gas suppliers since the early 1990s. And so I think this is an example of how that geopolitical pluralism works. For a while, we thought that the West was going to be the source of that pluralism, but for a variety of reasons, that hasn't panned out very much. And so maybe Chinese money moving in is the next best thing. Not only does it promote a more pluralistic environment, but it also contributes to the economic development of Central Asia itself. So if the security and the strategic problems that this region faces are largely connected to underdevelopment, and I'm not sure that that's entirely the case, but I think underdevelopment is certainly a contributing factor, then promoting economic development, promoting economic growth is certainly a net positive. It improves outcomes within the countries. It promotes greater opportunities for trade, which has overall benefits for economic well-being. And that is largely a good thing. It contributes to some extent to maintaining stability. The flip side, of course, and this is something that Alex Cooley has written about, is that it entrenches the existing corrupt, repressive political systems that you have in the Central Asian countries themselves. So it's a trade-off, and it's for this reason that many in the West would prefer that the strategic pluralism of Central Asia resulted from greater involvement and investment from Western sources rather than Chinese. But if that's not forthcoming, then China is better than nothing. And this is all true as long as Chinese economic influence is balanced by the existing political, cultural, strategic influence that Russia has historically played in the region. But the concern is that in the long run, the sheer size of China's investment, plus the infrastructure that it's laying, is going to shift the balance, is going to reorient the economies and ultimately the polities in Central Asia away from Russia and become increasingly part of a Chinese solar system, become a periphery of China that will then undermine their own international position, their own freedom of action in much the same way that Russia's military strategic involvement in the region was feared to do in the 1990s. So while Central Asia is not central to the United States in the same way that it is to Russia and China, it would nevertheless be suboptimal from the U.S. perspective and from the perspective of the Central Asian states themselves, I think, if they lost this flexibility as a result of a growing Chinese presence in the region. From the U.S. perspective, I think it's just worth mentioning the involvement in the war in Afghanistan. The decision to base troops in Central Asia in 2001, 2002, approval for that was given by the Central Asian governments over the objection of both Moscow and Beijing. And those countries were able to do that because they felt free enough, they didn't feel under the thumb enough of either Moscow or Beijing to prohibit the U.S. from doing so. And the concern from an American perspective is that if you have a Central Asian region that is increasingly under the thumb of China, that's simply not going to be possible. And as the U.S. looks forward to a time when it has a relationship with China that spans the globe, and when it potentially has a much more difficult task ahead of itself in terms of managing its relationship with China, I think it would very much like to have a presence in Central Asia, both to help develop the region itself, but also simply because of where the region is located vis-a-vis China. If the U.S.-China relationship is really going to be focused on the East and the Southeast and on global issues, there's some benefit for the United States to be able to have at least a listening post on China's western frontier, to have at least some presence there and some influence with those countries as it seeks to manage this relationship on a broader global level. And so the question, I guess, is whether under circumstances as they're currently developing, that will in fact be possible. Thanks.
Dan?
So I want to follow up on some of what Jeff said and say a few words about U.S. policy in the Central Asian region. We really haven't talked much about that today. We've talked about Russia, we've talked about China, and some of the other players. We really haven't talked about what the U.S. has been doing or is trying to do, with the exception of some of the comments that Jeff just made. And I think there's a danger in what's happened in the last few years, which is viewing our relationship with Central Asia only through the lens of Afghanistan. It's actually unfortunate that's the way it's come to be viewed. But we do have an interest, and this is actually, Jeff said it quite plainly, our fundamental interest is the independence and sovereignty of the Central Asian countries, and full stop. That's it. We've also heard a lot today about the transition that's going to take place in Afghanistan this year. For all the players in the region, the Central Asians, as well as Russia and China, there's a certain uncertainty involved in this, certain anxiety about how this will play out, and we'll have to wait and see. I should say a few more words about Afghanistan. While we haven't had as much progress as we had hoped with Afghanistan in some areas, the Afghans are now economically connected to their neighbors, including in Central Asia, in a way that they weren't 10 or 15 years ago. Today, Afghanistan trades more with its regional partners and neighbors than it does with the rest of the world. Customs revenues are up, goods are moving across the borders, and electricity is flowing from Central Asia through hydropower projects and other projects in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and that power is going to Afghanistan to keep the lights on. So maybe we are beginning to see the bridge that Richard Gassi mentioned this morning being utilized, at least to a limited extent. It's definitely a positive development, but a long way to go. So, what have we seen in terms of U.S. efforts to promote this? It's the vision of regional economic connectivity, which was laid out by Secretary Clinton in 2011, which we call the New Silk Road approach. It's important, in our view, in terms of our effort to anchor Afghanistan economically in the region. So Central Asia generally is one of the least economically integrated regions in the world. One kind of telling statistic, intra-regional trade within Central Asia accounts for only 6% of total global trade for the 5 Central Asian countries, plus Afghanistan. By comparison, if you look at the EU, the intra-EU trade is 64% of the trade turnover among the EU member states. So there's definitely a long way to go. The good news is that this intra-regional trade is growing, especially once barriers to cross-border movement of goods and people are removed. According to the ADB, the Asian Development Bank, the value of inter-regional trade in food products, minerals, and textiles has doubled since 2008. Interregional and extra-regional trade grew by an average of 20% over the last 10 years. So the potential is definitely there, which is why we in the U.S. government are working so hard with our partners in the region to translate the New Silk Road vision into concrete results. So what are the components of the New Silk Road vision? Of course, we talk on the one hand about physical connectivity, transportation, communications, energy infrastructure we've heard a lot about today, that link the countries in the region together and link them with perhaps South Asia, East Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. On the other hand, and equally important, we mean the practices, regulations, legislative bases, and international agreements in the areas of trade and transit that allow goods and services to flow effectively from country to country across this infrastructure. The United States has invested significant resources in political capital, particularly in this soft area of cooperation. We're also working with international financial institutions and private companies in their efforts to develop the hard infrastructure projects. Two of them I'd like to mention. One really hasn't been touched on today, which is the CASA 1000 project, and TAPI pipeline, which I think has been talked about in passing, but we can talk perhaps a little bit more about it. The CASA 1000 project is an electricity transmission project which will allow Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan to profit from their existing unused summer hydroelectric generation capacity and transmit and sell that power to Afghanistan and Pakistan. Pakistan in particular would benefit from a cheaper alternative to the oil-fueled power generation it's been using during peak demand period, since it's definitely short of gas and other fuels. By linking Central and South Asia energy markets, we see CASA 1000 as a transformative proof of concept that could pave the way for similar regional electricity projects. In fact, just last week, the World Bank approved funding of over $500 million for the CASA 1000 project. And we're looking at how CASA can be complementary to the efforts of the Asian Development Bank to build the TUTAP, TUTAP project, which will bring electricity from Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan to Afghanistan and ultimately to Pakistan. The TAPI pipeline would bring gas from Turkmenistan to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, and could be another transformative project. It would generate thousands of jobs along the way, and the pipeline would represent a major step forward in economic cooperation between Pakistan and India. And despite some recent setbacks, we're hopeful the project can move forward. We're working closely with all the TAPI parties to that end. I should say one of the interesting side benefits of the TAPI negotiations, which have been going on now for 5 or 6 years, and I think Jenik can comment on this as well, is because of the personal relationships that particularly the Pakistani and Indian officials have developed in the course of these negotiations and discussions, there's a certain level of trust that's beginning to emerge between Pakistan and India on energy matters. And there are now several energy cooperation projects between the two countries that are under discussion, which probably couldn't even be considered 5 years ago. This is one of the side benefits of the negotiations, whether or not the project actually comes to fruition. Now, a few words about China and how what we're doing may or may not fit in with what China is trying to do in their Silk Road Economic Belt program. We actually support the efforts of China to develop energy and transportation infrastructure in the region, including the projects that were announced during President Xi's visit last fall. We see these efforts and our efforts as mutually reinforcing and beneficial to the Central Asian countries and to Afghanistan. We are realistic. The United States is an important partner for the countries of the region, and our companies, American companies, are major players, particularly in the energy sector. But China, as a neighbor to these countries and as a result of its own dramatic economic growth, is naturally going to be a leader there in trade and investment. We acknowledge that. I'd like to say a few words about the overall energy sphere and the impact of what's going on in other parts of the world, perhaps on Central Asia and China and Russia as well. For the last several years, I think the focus in terms of this region in energy has been the so-called Southern Gas Corridor, which would bring gas from Azerbaijan across Georgia and Turkey, ultimately into Europe. This discussions on this particular project, a series of projects, have been going on now for 4 or 5 years, culminating last December with a final investment decision to actually develop the gas field in the Caspian and to build the various pipeline links that would take the gas to Europe. We have always said, and others have always made the point, that if Turkmenistan, for example, wants to join in the Southern Corridor and provide their gas into the Southern Corridor through a Trans-Caspian gas pipeline, which could be built, we would support it. Now, we've heard this afternoon, some of the reasons why this project may not be likely or feasible. There are questions about how serious Azerbaijan is actually about transiting gas from Turkmenistan or from Central Asia generally. Their question was raised about the legal status of the Caspian. That's not really an issue. I think Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan have reached the conclusion, which we support, which is if the two countries agree to build a pipeline that only passes through their territorial waters, no one else has a veto power over that decision. We know that the Russian and Iranian governments have objected, but from a legal standpoint, we think the project can be constructed without question. Now, one of the questions has been Turkmen reluctance to actually commit to this project or to put their gas in the southern corridor and move it to Europe. Despite an active role the EU has been playing in the last several years in trying to negotiate a trilateral agreement between the EU, Azerbaijan, and Turkmenistan without a lot of success. I think a couple of things that may perhaps influence the Turkmen decision going forward. Now that the southern corridor has become more of a reality, and it looks like at least there's a possibility of getting Turkmen gas to Europe, it's something that maybe the Turkmen will focus on again. And then the other question is what impact Crimea might have on Turkmen decision one way or another. I know the EU has continued to make the point in the last several weeks, in fact, that they would welcome Trans-Caspian pipeline being built and Turkmen gas joining in the southern corridor. There's a separate question which I don't think has been adequately addressed, which is whether Turkmen gas supplies to Europe is actually an economic viable project. I think it's at least open to question, given some of the issues in getting the gas from Azerbaijan to Europe and the additional distance and cost of Turkmen gas going even a longer distance. Now back to Crimea and the impact of Crimea. I think Jeff asked some good questions. How the events in Crimea will affect the thinking of the Central Asians and the Russians and the Chinese. I think on all those questions and all those issues, it's too early to tell. Will the tenor of Russia-China relations change as a result of Crimea? Perhaps. Will the Central Asians be more or less willing to resist the pressure to join the customs union? I think that's an open question. And I'd like to also make a few comments on some of the earlier presentations that struck me. One is on Kazakhstan. I think I have to disagree with Jeff on one point, which is I don't think that the percentage of Kazakh oil going to China will actually increase over time, despite the Chinese investments and the new expansion of the pipeline. If you actually factor in the additional production from Tengiz's future growth project, which will be none of the oil will go east to China. The difficulty in the Kashagan project, and even in that case, a relatively small percentage of the oil from that project at CNPC. I actually agree with one of the earlier speakers who said that percentage is likely to actually fall in the future. Gas is another question. It's an interesting question. With the construction of a west-east pipeline across Kazakhstan, theoretically, Kazakhstan could become a significant exporter of gas to China. The basic problem is there's very little excess gas available in Kazakhstan. Most of the gas production is actually reinjected to keep up the oil production. A lot of the gas from Karachaganak, which is one of the major fields, actually goes north into Orenburg in Russia for processing, and it's probably going to also continue in the future. So I think there's a real question as to how much Kazakhstan could contribute in terms of additional gas sales to China. I'd like to make another comment on Chinese involvement and maybe unforeseen consequences and blowback or backlash. I think somebody mentioned earlier today that Chinese had built a new coal-fired power plant in Dushanbe.
We smelled it, didn't we? You and I did.
We did. Ed and I were in Dushanbe in January, and the power plant, one unit of the power plant had just gone into operation. You could see it already over the city. They built it almost in the center of the city. Not a great decision, and it'll be even worse when they actually have to truck the coal in from the coal mine. I don't know how far it is outside the city. You'll have additional trucks, driving through the city with these huge loads of coal, additional environmental issues, and from what we understand, this particular project also was developed with a lack of transparency, to say the least. So I understand one of the motivations for the Tajiks in building this project, having this project built by the Chinese and identified as a priority was Tajikistan has traditionally been dependent on the Uzbeks for gas supplies. Those gas supplies have periodically been cut off because of other issues between the two countries. And so as a result, partly as a result of this project, Tajikistan will no longer have to import gas from Uzbekistan. Whether any of that makes economic sense is a separate issue. Another comment on the cutoff of gas supply to Shymkent that was referenced earlier. Actually, the cutoff of gas supplies to southern Kazakhstan through the existing CAC pipeline and the branch that goes to Almaty, those have been going on for at least 10 or 15 years. It's been a continuing problem when it gets cold in Tashkent and they cut back supplies to Kazakhstan. I think, again, the more likely outcome in terms of additional Kazakh gas being available is the gas will go from western to southern Kazakhstan to be utilized there. I don't think a lot of it's going to end up going on to China because it probably isn't that much to go. That particular event actually brings to mind how the knock-on effect of some of these events. There was an incident a couple of years ago where Turkmenistan, of course, supplies gas to Iran through two pipelines, and they got into a fight a couple of years ago about the price of the gas. And as a result, during the winter, of course, the Turkmen cut the gas supplies to Iran. Of course, the Iranians supply gas to Turkey. So when the Turkmen cut the gas supplies to Iran, the Iranians cut the gas supplies to Turkey. Turkey supplies a small volume of gas to Greece. So when they got cut back by the Iranians, the Greeks got cut back. So what happened with Turkmenistan and Iran reverberated all the way to Athens. Very interesting how these things are connected. I'd like to also make one comment about the potential impact of U.S. LNG exports, a lot of which has been written about. There's been a lot written about this in the last few weeks, particularly in light of Crimea. Actually, 7 projects have now been licensed or have preliminary conditional approval from the Department of Energy. The total volume is about 95 billion cubic meters, which is about half the volume, a little over half the volume of gas that is now going into Europe in LNG. I'm sorry, that's not the right figure. It's half the volume of Russian supplies to Europe, which is about 170 billion cubic meters. There are 7 projects that have received conditional approval. Only one has final approval. That project is slated to go into operation in 2015, 2016. It's an open question how quickly the other projects will ultimately get their approval, how many of them will actually be realized. Ed can perhaps comment on this point as well. I think, Ed, I'll set you up with a couple of other things you can comment on that I prefer not to, which is whether this 80 billion cubic meter of gas, Central Asian gas to China that people talk about is actually going to happen, whether Line D is actually going to be built. As I mentioned, the impact that U.S. LNG could actually have on global markets over the short to medium term. How good a deal the Chinese Central Asia pipeline investment and their investment in Turkmenistan really is for China and for Turkmenistan. Turkmen are having some second thoughts themselves about the deal. And finally, when we talk about these negotiations on gas sales, We've tended to talk only about the gas price. There are other issues. I think Ed hinted at this in his question earlier, which is the production costs and the transport cost of actually getting the gas to the market. So again, you need to think in economic, commercial terms. If there's one lesson we learned from the Caspian pipelines in the 1990s and more recently with the failure of the Nabucco project, it is political support is important to get a project realized. I would say it's a necessary but not sufficient condition for a project to be realized, but political support alone won't do it. And if the project doesn't make commercial sense and have a strong backer, commercial champion, it's not going to happen. Just another thing to keep in mind as we talk about these projects. There are, of course, exceptions to this general rule. If a country that has the financial capability decides for their own strategic or energy security needs that they want to build a project, whether it's a pipeline or another project that doesn't make economic sense and they can afford to do it, they can do it. But if you want a project to be commercially financed, which is what happens with most projects, you have to have these basic conditions of a commercially viable deal so that lenders and investors get a return on their investment. So I think I'll stop there.
So our last speaker for today, but it still will be questions answered, and I will make the closing remark, is Ed Chow. And I'd like to add provocatively, Ed is clearly an American citizen, but he has Chinese heritage. So I leave it to you to think that we're having a closer from the Chinese heritage in Eurasia.
I can take a poll afterwards. Thank you very much, Jenik. One of the problems of being the last speaker is trying to figure out something that hasn't already been said. Lucky for me, I missed the first panel, so I have that excuse. Also, I'm following two colleagues and old friends. Jeff, with his splendid academic background, has been very comprehensive in his laying out of what the regional dynamics look like. Dan, as usual, has been very careful. Lucky for you, I'm completely undisciplined. So I'm liable to be provoked by Jenik to say almost anything. And thanks, Dan, for teeing me up. So I'm going to make some observations that are hopefully germane to the topic that I think it's important to inform the discussion as well as your thinking on this set of issues that the conference is trying to address. One is, and some of these may be obvious, one is that China is the incremental demand center for the world in oil and gas. That's certainly been true for oil for the past 10, 20 years. More than 40% of incremental global demand for oil has come from China in the last couple of decades. We, the United States, through most of the post-war period, for lots of reasons that I won't get into, used to be the incremental demand center. We are no longer that. Western Europe almost doesn't count because their demand doesn't grow. Import may grow a little bit, but demand doesn't grow. So China, over the next decade, will likely be the incremental demand center for the world as well, and maybe India more prominently in the decade after that. The Middle East also counts as a big demand center, but it really doesn't matter as much because so much of that energy is subsidized. If they wanted to export more, they just have to ratchet down the subsidies a little bit in order to control demand. So China is the incremental demand center. We're not. And this is particularly true because of the unconventional oil and gas revolution in the United States. Sometime this year, or on an annual basis, most likely this year, China will be the largest oil importer in the world, exceeding the United States. There was 1 or 2 months last year where that was the case as well. So this is very, very important. Dan mentioned that our number one fundamental interest, United States interest, in Central Asia is the political independence, economic the autonomy implicitly of countries in that region. In the 1990s, there used to be a second objective, which is that since we're the largest oil importer in the world, any additional oil that comes onto the world market benefits the United States, whether it comes to the U.S. or not. It really didn't matter, we would benefit. That used to be an important objective in the 1990s. Interesting counterfactual to ponder is if we were in the 1990s in the same position in terms of oil and gas prospects that we are in now, would we have cared about Kazakhstan and other Central Asian countries as much as we did then? Impossible to prove, but it's interesting to think about. The second point I want to make is that gas is very different from oil. And for reasons that Morena has already pointed out, so I won't repeat those. But for China also, gas is very different from oil. China has gone through the oil growth boom, import boom. It's likely to slow down its future growth in oil growth as well as oil imports. But for China, gas is just the beginning of the story. Chinese gas demand is maybe 5% max of primary energy consumption. The global average is around 20. So if you look at the Chinese objective of moving to 10% natural gas in the primary energy mix, and when you consider that the demand itself is growing, so it's not only the share growing, but the overall demand is growing, that's going to have a major impact. That would change the global gas market in a way that we're just beginning to see. We don't really know yet what that might look like. India, again, is not too far behind. Part of that point on gas is we don't know what Chinese domestic gas production is going to look like in the future, nor do the Chinese, by the way. If you look at most conventional Chinese demand projections beyond 2020, they assume that unconventional gas would become available. And the Chinese definition of unconventional gas is a little different from ours, so it's more than shale gas. It's coal-bed methane, it's gas, it's coal gasification, it's tight gas as well as shale gas. So if their assumption seems to be that imports will grow up until 2020, and then it will stop growing. You look at Chinese forecasts, that's how they read. So I always ask Chinese scholars, what if you keep your objective of growing gas in consumption, but your domestic production doesn't grow past 2020? What happens then? And as sometimes happens when you ask a Chinese, in this case I'm an American, I guess, that kind of question, you don't get an answer. Because I think this is an interesting question. A lot of things, essential ingredients to the shale gas revolution, unconventional oil and gas revolution in this country is not present in China right now. So there will be a lot of domestic reform, pricing, first of all, but also organizational market reform that will need to take place for them to reach the objectives that they have set for themselves. So therefore, state enterprise reform, the vision that was set by the party's third plenum last fall, becomes very important in terms of how those reforms are going to be implemented. Thirdly, I want to point out that Jenik made the observation that even state capitalism needs to make money. Now, state capitalism could have different metrics to measure what is success. But, you know, it's also important ultimately to have some financial return as well. Maybe it's not the same level of financial return that an international major would want, but, you know, it's not good to lose money even on state capitalism. I think it's an interesting question, and Dan mentioned this. I don't know that anyone has the answer to the question on whether Chinese investments, overseas investment in oil and gas has been a good return or not. I'm not sure the Chinese know. We know from historical experience that the Japanese taxpayer paid tens of billions of dollars over the past 30, 40 years to diversify their oil and gas supply. You actually pay for it at the pump if you're a Japanese taxpayer. And most of that money by Jenik, JPEX, JOGMEG today have all been spent, and Japan's oil and gas import position is exactly the same as what it was in 1980. So nothing changed in terms of you improving your condition. What we do know, and I think that one more thing to correct from the previous panel, is that China doesn't have it has one PSA in Turkmenistan. Most of the gas will likely not come from PSAs, which China don't currently have. These are loans for supply deals. They are not equity investments. I'm not a Russian speaker, so I often get confused when Russians talk about investments when they mean loans. I can tell you I am a Chinese speaker, and there's a big difference in the words between investment and loans. What I do know also is that the Turkmen are complaining the Chinese gas price is too low, and the fact that they didn't realize their loans had to be repaid, and therefore they're not getting as much cash out of the deal as they thought they would get. I also know that the Chinese are complaining about the price of Turkmen gas at the border because the government had not, up until recently, allowed CNPC to pass on the costs of that gas. So are these good business deals or not good business deals? We don't really know. Maybe too soon to tell. Also, but it's not at all beyond my imagination to know, to think that these may not be as good deals as sometimes we assume that when other people do deals, they must be good deals. But it may be that they're just wasting a lot of their money. And so, again, state enterprise reform, where the central government is now demanding a certain level of dividends back from the state enterprises, will become an important reform factor in the future. Corruption was mentioned this morning, but I'm not sure you got an answer to the question of what's happening with Zhou Rongkong and how far the corruption extends in the oil and gas sector. This is not the first case. We also saw the previous CEO of Sinopec ran into rather similar problems. So if you got corruption on top of an opaque system that measures success differently, do we really understand what's going on? My last point is that there's been a lot of talk about Russian-Chinese energy cooperation, rightly so, this morning. One thing that hasn't been mentioned very much is whether there's scope for Western Chinese cooperation in Central Asia or not, or Western Indian cooperation in Central Asia. I think we had tended, as Jeff rightly pointed out, to see China as a counterweight to Russians' influence and interests in Central Asia, but not necessarily as a partner. Kashagan is going to show us potentially a different way of looking at it, perhaps. I would remind the audience that we had an opportunity to do this 10 years ago, and the Western oil companies, in their short-sightedness, I think, blocked CNOOC's attempt to acquire an equity interest in Kashagan. And now 10 years later, we have a different Chinese partner in the Kashagan deal, which we now know is a much more difficult project than we previously realized. $50 billion in, something right ballpark, and not a cent in return yet. So, I hope the Chinese know what they're doing in getting into Kashagan. There are Western companies who seem quite desperate to reduce their interests in Kashagan as well. So when you talk about projects like Galkanish, which may be an even more difficult project, potentially, the gas field in Turkmenistan, being on the same page with China, who will be a major player in Central Asia, may be to our mutual benefit. Jeff mentioned the word free rider, which I love when people talk about China. He was talking about it in the context of China being a free rider in a securities system that Russia contributes more to in Central Asia. We talk about it in terms of the oceans and the South China Sea and so on. It's an interesting way of thinking about it. Now maybe I can become a Chinese. How's that? Yes. That whenever China doesn't do anything, other folks accuse China of being a free rider. When China starts to do something, then everyone else feels threatened by China, right? So China can't win. It's either a free rider because it doesn't do enough, or it's threatening its neighbors when it tries to start doing something. We've got to make up our mind which way our policy should encourage the direction of Chinese policy by thinking of them as a country that have legitimate interests in Central Asia and on a case-by-case basis or occasionally a partner of Western interests in Central Asia as well. Thank you.
Before I open it up to questions, I'd like to make one observation which I think is the obvious and that is frequently overlooked or not fully recognized and taken into consideration. Central Asian countries plus Afghanistan, which could be deemed a Central Asian country depending on how you look at a definition, are landlocked. That's one. Along with that, it has been documented around the world that natural investors are your neighbors. U.S. to Canada, U.S. to Mexico, Germany to the Czech Republic, Austria to Hungary, although it's small. Neighbors invest in neighbors for the simple reason, as one German once said, I can drive my Mercedes, okay, he's doing well, to Prague. You can go there. And when we sometimes look at Central Asia, and I will say you could raise that even about U.S. policy, can we really have a Central Asia where Russia will not be an active player, where China will not be an active player, and where a third party that's far away can really be the instrumental player? So the question is, when you look at that, are we sometimes trying to prevent natural developments which have to be there just because they're next to each other? They are neighbors. And that's one thing which I think I've seen continuously overlooked. Or we try to create artificial walls, barriers. Why should not a country deal with its neighbor, irrespective of the political? They are a neighbor. And I think that as we go forward, both from a political and economic, and look at Central Asia into ones, where should Kazakhstan sell? It can sell to Russia. Well, doesn't seem likely because it doesn't need the energy, but China's one. If it wants to sell to India, well, it's got to get there. So why do we continually try to create constructs or ones that are not even within the geographical ready possibilities? I will not answer that question, although I have my prejudice. But I will raise now, let you ask questions. What we'll do is, since I do have the wrap-up, we can still go up for about 15 minutes, and I'd like to do it the following way. Obviously, first order for anyone who spoke this afternoon. I know some of you have actually had questions that you wanted for some other speakers. If you do that, please identify the speaker that you would like to address it, but otherwise let us assume it's for this panel. Again, please come to the center, identify, give your name and your affiliation. There must be some questions. Yeah. What a gentleman. Ladies first. Good. I like that.
Okay. Nargis Kasyanova, Kimap University. I have maybe a very naive question, but
Can you speak up, please?
Okay. Maybe my question is very naive, actually. But Chinese participation in Kashagan. Can one of the reasons be the desire to acquire know-how, with the difficult offshore projects? Acquiring experience. Will it be worth it? Even, participating kind of at this stage.
Can you repeat the question?
Whether Chinese participation in Kashagan has something to do with wanting to learn about offshore projects. China has actually been, mind if I answer now? China has actually been producing oil offshore since the 1970s, at least. It just started production on the deep water field last week, I think, or maybe this week even. Kashagan is a very expensive lesson if that's what you want to acquire. Kashagan's technical challenges have not only to do with its location, which is in shallow waters, not deep waters, but also to do with the depth of the field, the high pressure, high temperature, sow gas, and all of that. Maybe there's more to that than the whole offshore-onshore difference, I would say. Dan?
Yeah, the one other complication you didn't mention is that the Caspian in the north, where the Kashagan is located, is frozen 8 or 9 months out of the year. So literally they had to build artificial islands in the Caspian from which they're doing the drilling. But yes, it's an expensive lesson, and ONGC is probably breathing a sigh of relief right now if they got knocked out.
Thank you, Raffaello Panticci. I had a question maybe to pick up on something that Jeffrey talked about, which is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And I think you broadly rubbished it, and I can understand exactly why you would do that, because it's an organization which has really done very little considering its sort of aspirations. I'd be interested to hear if you think there's any part of it that could actually be seen to be doing something successful. Or do you think there is anything within the structure that it's creating, the regional structure within Central Asia, that could play some sort of beneficial role, be it in energy or be it in some other capacity?
Okay. I wouldn't dismiss the SCO entirely. I would say that it's been primarily an umbrella for initiatives that have been undertaken at a bilateral level, to the extent that it's accomplished much. That said, and there's not a lot of transparency, so sometimes it's hard to tell, but certainly you hear discussions about the things that are done, for example, with the RATS, the Anti-Terrorist Center cooperation. And there is clearly some kind of intelligence sharing going on. And this actually gets back to the Uyghur issue, because from the Chinese perspective, what are you concerned about on the security front? Well, it's this, and I think they've done a pretty good job of getting the Central Asian countries to work together with them on that particular issue. There was at one point verbal agreement on the development bank issue, and then it didn't happen. So as a forum for discussing these things, it's there. I think it provides a vehicle for having some of these conversations, but the Russian and the Chinese visions of what it's supposed to be, I think, are still pretty far apart. On top of that, the question of who's in and who's out and what exactly is it for, I think, makes it increasingly amorphous. I mean, now Turkey is a dialogue partner, which I don't even know what that means, but and so it's very amorphous, and I think it kind of suffers from having these two 800-pound gorillas in the room together who don't see eye to eye.
I beg to differ with both the question and the answer, which is the SCO has done exactly what the Chinese designed it to do, which is to allow Chinese economic penetration of Central Asia with the umbrella of Russian political blessing. I don't think it was supposed to do anything more than that. And so from a Chinese point of view, it has served its purpose and continues to serve the purpose of Chinese economic penetration without overtly threatening Russia in any political way. So, what's not to like?
I would like to add, in support of Ed's statement, that my Chinese colleagues in the discussion on the SCO said, effectively, are you naive? We're getting the natural resources. What more do we want? So that was the economic interest.
Hi. Thank you. It was a great panel. I have a question for
Can you speak up, please?
Yes, Jeff Mankoff. You said that there was this political uncertainty given by the uncertain succession in many Central Asian countries, like Karimov or Nazarbayev, who are presidents for life. What do you think are kind of the prospects of the political situation after this succession, in terms of the political risks you envisaged before? And the second question is for Dr. Stein. You spoke about the Trans-Caspian pipeline, and you said that this sort of the legal status of the Caspian is not so much of an issue, it could be solved. And also the Azeris have a little bit of a problem competing with Turkmen gas, perhaps, but even that could be solved. And my question is, assuming that both of these issues were a non-issue that much, what do you think this Trans-Caspian gas, what kind of market would it go to supply? Because as we know, right now, Europe is oversupplied already. Russia is determined to build its South Stream. We have this new TAP, 10 BCM pipeline. So I'm wondering, what kind of market would that pipeline be targeting?
Okay. I guess I'll go first. First, let me just say, I don't disagree with Ed's take on the SCO. I think, actually, that's about right. The Russians wanted something much more from it than that, and they didn't get it. And I think the Central Asians maybe wanted something else from it and didn't get it. But maybe if that's all that Beijing ever wanted, then it's a success from their point of view, at the very least. With regard to successions in Central Asia and the political risk. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, obviously, what the succession in any of these countries is going to look like. When Turkmen Basha died, I don't think anybody would have picked his dentist to come out as the successor in a relatively successful, peaceful transition. So, we have that example to look to, but then again, we also have the rather chaotic examples of Kyrgyzstan, the two times that there have been successions there. So I think the answer is we just don't know. The danger is probably greater in Uzbekistan than Kazakhstan, just because there are stronger regional factions. There's more instability already. There's a bigger sort of militancy problem. And I think you have more just sort of angry people, and the social problems are bigger. But again, I don't think we have a great sense of how the process is going to work. We don't know what's being plotted behind the scenes. I think we can be pretty sure at this point that Gulnara is not going to be the successor. But short of that, I don't know. But I think there is at the very least, real reason to be concerned that you could have an unmanaged transition, which could create various kinds of political risk.
On the question of, basically you're asking the question about European gas demand, and we start talking about the potential for trickling gas. Europe is currently well supplied, perhaps you could say oversupplied, but that's a short-term phenomenon. Domestic production in Europe is continuing to decline. There will be growth in demand. So I think the feeling is in the market that there will be an increase in European gas utilization in the future. South Stream, you have to remember, is not new gas. If it's built, it's the same gas that's now going to Ukraine. It's just going to the same customers through the same route. So it really doesn't impact on Russian domination, if you will, of the European market.
Yeah, hi, Ned Conway at PricewaterhouseCoopers. I just want to pick up, Dan, on what you were saying before, because it's with regard to Shimken, and to kind of just think out loud about the particular issue, because I absolutely don't disagree with the idea that Uzbek shutting off gas now or limiting gas not really anything new. Also, don't disagree with the idea that China, in the general scheme of things, isn't getting a tremendous amount of gas from the concept of the west-east pipeline within Kazakhstan. My question is just, so given that, how would you interpret that small instance in 1,000 other things that are going on right now? But how would you interpret that from a what are the Chinese getting out of that? I mean, it seems to me like, and if I'm wrong here, disagree with me for sure, but the Kazakhs they're decreasing their exposure to the Uzbeks. They're gasifying a couple of cities that could use it. What's in it for the Chinese in that sense? Does that tie into anything larger, such as a possible, strategy that China has within the region? Thanks.
I don't know the answer, but as Ed, asked the question whether we should assume that Chinese investments in these projects are really good investments. Yeah,
And loans need to be paid back.
which will be repaid. So.
Why do it?
Ed?
Why do it if it's a loan?
Okay, so one point I didn't have a chance to make during my presentation is that I think from my point of view, and I coupled this with the 80 BCM that won't be available from Turkmenistan by 2020, is that the Chinese are buying an option. Because they don't know what the future is going to look like post-2020, and they want to be the first in the queue in getting any incremental oil and gas supply from Central Asia. And loans is one way of doing it. I mean, how do you repay the loan? You can either pay me back in cash or you can pay me back in oil or gas. And if you owe me money, then I get first call on it rather than someone else. So from my point of view, what they're paying for is an option on future supply without having committed to it, because loans need to be paid back whether you sell me any oil and gas or not. I mean, that's the way I would see it.
I would add one more thing. From the Chinese perspective of, quotes, foreign aid, they do expect it to be repaid. Foreign aid in the Western world has frequently been forgiven. So that is a different one, that you cannot just assume that one country operates the way another does. The other thing I'd like to underscore what Ed said before is the following. Are Chinese companies overseas, the energy, natural resource companies, making money? Well, one of the ways that you cannot figure it out is they're putting an input into companies that are manufacturing the widgets that we're buying or the toys that we're buying or whatever. So it comes back to what I said before. At the end of the day, it might be an accounting challenge that's impossible to figure out, but what is China Inc. and who's making the money and who's getting it? So you might just have to look at national statistics, but the option is a good, firm approach, which I think makes total legal sense and commercial sense.
Hello. I just wanted to go back to the
You
previous...
have to identify yourself.
Linda Lalabwali, Jenik is my boss. So I just wanted to go back to the previous panel conversation on CSR in China, because I do remember a member of the panel talking about how we could be mystifying Chinese investment. I just wanted to talk about that in light of an issue that Chinese investors are encountering in my country, which is Algeria. So there has been increasing tensions between Chinese investors and the Chinese community and local groups, local terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda in North Africa, that have been, mentioning some threats and attacking convoys. And that issue comes from 3 different factors. One being that there is an issue with local content, especially employment of locals in Algeria, because the Chinese companies are not necessarily arguing that they're employing Chinese because there are no Algerians that are qualified. They're actually employing Chinese in low-level jobs. The second is the Uyghur situation, which has actually been used by those groups to threaten those investors because they're considered to represent Chinese interests. And the third has been the Chinese government treatment of the entire Arab Spring and the fact that it did not align with Western governments. So I just wanted to know if, in light of these factors, and especially Chinese investment in the Middle East and North Africa, if you think that China may develop its own policy because they're facing different security issues that no Western company has faced in the past, and if so, what could that be?
I think the lessons learned by both African countries, as well as to a certain extent Latin American countries, who welcomed Chinese investment with open arms when they first arrived a number of years ago, is that maybe the Chinese are not as different as they thought they would be, because the bias was that Western companies have been exploiting us for decades, and now we're going to get someone else in who's going to treat us differently, and it turns out the Chinese don't do things so differently. Now, it was Statoil's facility that was attacked in the gas plant in Algeria. So the Chinese are not alone. The Chinese oil companies have a different problem. And it's a problem related to what Jenik mentioned about the German model. International oil companies have basically outsourced all their services. So they don't have many of their own employees. And their contractors source labor from the global market. So you're just as likely to see a Filipino working on an offshore platform in Nigeria for Chevron, let's say. The Chinese oil companies are in the same model the IOCs, Western IOCs were in the 1960s and 1970s. They control all their service companies, and they have to provide those people with jobs. Now, those folks can't be idle. So there's a social responsibility more to China than to Algeria or some other countries to keep those folks fully employed. So, I once was told the statistics that CNPC have more employees than the PLA has soldiers. I kind of doubt that's true, but the fact that even the Chinese suggested that to me gives you an order of magnitude. There really are close to 1 million workers for CNPC if you count all the affiliated service companies. So Chinese bring their laborers with them partly because they're supposed to keep their laborers employed. That's not a problem that ExxonMobil has. ExxonMobil doesn't find a project particularly attractive, then it cancels the contract with the contractor, and the contractor layoffs the employees. I mean, that's just the way it is. So it's corporate social responsibility, maybe not in the sense that you mentioned it, but the Chinese have their internal challenges that are probably not well understood outside of China. Probably doesn't answer the question.
But let me add something to it, which is totally from a different perspective. but it's a number of years ago in an unpublished research work that I did on Chinese investment in Africa. I wanted to see if they're going to act for some other reason as a normal company or a Western company, if normal is that defined. And I found out they were reacting, let's say, differently, or beginning to, because I had someone document how many people, Chinese workers, were killed, how many Chinese workers were kidnapped and otherwise harmed. And it turned out to be that dramatically increased. So in other words, they were not getting the results that they thought they did by dealing door to door with just the president of the country. So they were finding that they had a responsibility. And then the next order of question was exactly the way Ed refuted is, wow, they're actually reacting to their workers who are concerned about being kidnapped. So you would have thought that they would have had a different command economy if you wanted, but they didn't. So they started taking things more seriously and, in quote, starting CSR, if you want, in some fashion, for the simple reason, I use it very almost negatively, self-preservation, because they needed what they didn't understand, a social license in a totally different sort of environment. So it goes to the same thing from a totally different perspective. The only regret I have is that I didn't publish the paper with all the statistics. It would have been very enlightening. Okay? Let me just... Well, we've had a long day starting in the morning and kept it up in the afternoon. And one of the things, besides wanting to thank all the panelists for coming from wherever they did, including from as far away, I think Kazakhstan was the furthest this time. Chinese scholars, actually a visiting scholar here at Columbia, and just coming from across the pond, and Afghanistan. That's another one. So we have had visitors. It's one of the great things about Columbia that we can bring people from around the world. But on this topic, one of the things, and I have been doing it for 8 years now, using pipelines, not as the be-all and the end-all, but just as a way of looking at certain things, particularly in the Eurasian space, because it's geographic space. Kazakhstan can't use a tanker, really, to get its stuff out. It might go across the Caspian a little bit, but it cannot. They're landlocked. So pipelines is a way of looking at energy. It's not necessarily a be-all of the energy. It's a perspective of a much broader picture. But what I found past is looking at things specifically. So one of the things that's absolutely clear now, even from the Chinese perspective, that's come across this morning and this afternoon. One, it's complex. Two, at the end of the day, the way Ed and I both have summed it up, are the Chinese really all that different at the end of the day when you put it that way? Or are they just acting differently because we don't have the necessary transparency or to look in because they're acting in a little bit like China Inc.? But do businesses really put out their documents anyway? It's been interesting to me when I've dealt with, on the scholarly side, well, that document's not public. Well, yes, there's information in it that you might want to need. So I think that the message to be taken away is energy in Central Asia, for many reasons, is a mixed bag. It's politics and economics, but I share the viewpoint that Dan mentioned, and he didn't mention that it was Ed who used the term. We need a commercial champion. That can be state, that can be private, but there needs to be a commercial champion. Even governments don't want to lose money on a regular basis. So we do have a reception afterwards, wine, etc., for those who wish to imbibe. And thank you for coming, and see you next year. Alex, do you want to say anything? Or?